About 13 years ago, a few buddies and I were really into urbex. We didn't call it that back then. We weren't part of any sort of community, nor were we into taking photographs of places we visited. We'd find some old apocalyptic-looking derelict on a Friday or Saturday night, get some beers and some smokes, then spend the night getting wasted and fantasizing about zombie survival scenarios. I've pretty much settled down now. I'm in a long-term relationship, and we're even talking about having kids. I doubt my girlfriend would be too keen on me exploring old abandoned buildings, but that's not exactly why I don't urbex anymore. The reason I stopped is because of what we say at the Danvers State Medical Hospital shortly before it was demolished back in 2007. So, there's this movie that came out in 2001 called Session 9. We saw it in the movie theater near Boston Common and were instantly obsessed. Sure, it's a good movie, but the star isn't really David Caruso. The real star is Danvers State Medical Hospital. Location scouts must have giggled like schoolgirls when they laid eyes on Danvers. It looks more like Hogwarts than a place where some of Massachusetts' most dangerous mental patients were housed. The huge Gothic building was built in 1874, and it was quite the sight to behold. Seriously, Google it and you'll see for yourself. But in the early 90s, it was abandoned when all remaining patients were transferred to other sites. Once we learned that the magnificent-looking building was only 13 minutes north of Boston, we were already making plans to visit for a little midnight drinking session. One Friday night, we make the drive up there, parking our buddy's car about a mile away before walking over to the abandoned hospital. We may or may not have committed criminal damage in breaking through the flimsy perimeter fencing. I'd rather not say anything too incriminating. I don't want to get arrested over some dumb Reddit post, but once we were inside, it's as incredible as we imagined. The place didn't feel like it had ever been a hospital. We picture hospitals these days as being these white-on-steel, sterile places, but Danvers really did feel like it was straight out of a Harry Potter movie. Intricate patterns on the tiled floor, grand staircases, more like an old mansion than a treatment center. We're still in awe when we decide to make our way up on one of the staircases to explore the upper floors, wandering down long, dark corridors with the only light being from cheap plastic flashlights we were carrying. One such corridor had lots and lots of smaller rooms running off of it. It was clearly some kind of high security wing. The rooms looked more like prison cells than hospital rooms. There were even rusted iron shackles still attached to some of the walls. Evidently, some prisoners were restrained when they became too violent. But when I shined my flashlight into another one of the smaller cell-like rooms, I froze. Caught in my torch beam was the dull steel of a steak knife. I can still remember how its teeth glittered in the bright white light. Next to it, a rather dirty-looking sleeping bag lay on the cold tiled floor. Someone was here with us. I can't remember who said it, but one of my buddies muttered something about us not being alone here, and when a strange voice spoke through the darkness, I think all of us just jumped out of our skin. "Hi." That's all it said, at first anyway. There's a young, dirty homeless guy walking down the corridor towards us, hands up and palms out. I can't remember the exact exchange. My adrenaline was pumping the entire time, but I'll try to paraphrase. We were just about to leave, dude. We don't want any trouble." It's all good," he replied. Something friendly in his voice set me at ease. "I really didn't mean to scare you guys." "It's cool, kind of a scary place anyway." He separated from what I assumed was his steak knife, but I still kept my eyes on where it was sat in the darkness, making sure he won't be able to grab it if he decides he doesn't like us so much. But, as I said, he was actually pretty friendly for a guy who seemed to be living in an abandoned insane asylum. We gave him a beer, a kind of peace offering, and then spent about a half an hour just wandering the corridors and talking. None of us wanted to press him on why he was there. He seemed nice enough, so We passed the time talking about Boston, complaining about the Sox, that sort of thing. After a while, he does in fact tell us some of his story. How he's been a drifter for a while. Not exactly homeless, but not exactly the 9-to-5 kind of dude either. He liked to explore weird old places too, so that was like another half hour listening to all the awesome abandoned places he'd visited across America. He'd even been to Bodie, California, which has like this legendary status among urbex enthusiasts because it's an entire mining town that was abandoned after the gold rush or something. So, about the point that we're thinking this is one of the coolest guys we've ever met, he asks us something that, at first, we thought was some kind of joke. So, you guys are human, right? One of my buddies actually laughed, but the guy shot him this look. And man, if looks could kill. He was serious, and the more it dawned on us that he was 100% serious, the more freaked out we became. I just, hate meeting cool people than finding out they're reptilians, you know? You can only really tell once you peel that fake layer of skin off. I mean, that's what the knife is for. He'd seen my eyes flicking towards it. Don't look so nervous, dude. You guys seem cool, but sometimes it just gets real tiring. They've been after me for so long now, and they never ever stop. Sometimes I think I should just kill everyone just to be safe. An uncomfortable silence came over us. I wanted to run from this crazy monster, but that might anger him. And we really didn't want to anger him. Dang, dude, we're almost out of beer. One of my buddies says. Here, man, why don't you take our last one? We'll go buy some more and be back in like an hour. Again, probably not word for word, but I'll never forget the relief I felt when he said those words. It was a stroke of absolute genius to be able to get us out of there so quickly, without raising too much suspicion in the guy. The homeless-looking crazy person seemed very happy at this, like he'd made himself a trio of new friends, guys he could finally trust. And as we walked out of Danvers and back towards the car, I felt a new, fresh feeling. Guilt. I'm an urban explorer. Urban exploration, or urbex, as we call it in the community, is the exploration of man-made structures, often abandoned or hidden from the general public. Generally speaking, photography has played a large role in its popularity, but historical documentation has also become a factor in recent years. As austerity has taken hold in the UK, urban decay has become much more prominent, with abandoned factories, amusement parks, and other such places becoming increasingly common across the country. To my knowledge, the term urban exploration was invented in the mid-90s by a Canadian guy by the name Jeff Chapman. But one particularly harrowing story tells of a French urban explorer by the name of Philibert Espert. The story goes that Monsieur Espert was a hospital porter in the 18th century who had heard rumors that there were riches to be found in the deep, winding catacombs beneath Paris. Priceless jewels, golden medallions, and 100-year-old bottle of expensive spirits waited for those who were brave enough to search for them. Monsieur Espert packed a knapsack, bid his wife adieu, then wandered down into the catacombs in search of his fortune. His skeleton was discovered in the damp, dark tunnels just over 11 years later. Now, I'm not sure if I believe that story. There's always been a kind of glamour that came with the apparent dangers of urban exploration, and I'd be lying if I'd said I didn't find that attractive. But the story of the French explorer seems a little too far-fetched for me, not to mention that the risks involved these days are minimal. It's pretty much impossible to get lost, and an emergency mobile phone means that medical assistance is usually just minutes away. That being said, it doesn't mean you find some genuinely weird or disturbing things while exploring. And not too long ago, myself and a friend of mine explored a place that actually made me question if I wanted to involve myself in urbex anymore. Just out of Farnham, in a leafy rural place called Surrey in England, stands an old abandoned puppy mill. The building has been deserted since 82-year-old John Lowe was arrested for killing his former partner and her daughter with a high-powered shotgun. He had shot his wife, Christine Lee, at point-blank range with a shotgun, later telling police that he wanted to put her down. His daughter, Lucy Lee, made a call to the emergency services before courageously returning to the scene of the crime to face her killer one final time. The building has a sinister air about it before we even laid eyes on it, but when we'd actually seen the thing, the apprehension was palpable. It looked like a typical haunted house, all red brick and Victorian arches, like it was just waiting to be the cover art of the next Stephen King novel. We took a few pictures, nervously chuckling to each other as we made our way inside. The interior has been almost completely gutted. There wasn't a scrap of furniture to be seen, and almost all of the electrical fittings had been torn out to prevent accidental fires. The glass windows of the conservatory attached to the house had smashed wholesale. Not a single pane of glass had survived some previous visit from local vandals. It only added to the eerie feeling of the place, like some terrible vengeance had been wrought by angry locals, trying to destroy a place that was haunted by so many terrible events. My friend and I separated as I ventured upstairs while he remained on the ground floor, searching the kitchen. The upstairs bedrooms were still carpeted, but leaks in the roof meant that larger patches of black mold were growing on the walls and floors. The place reeked of rot. Yet, just as I was headed back downstairs, I heard my friend call out for me to join him in the kitchen. And all the time I'd known him, I'd never ever known him to sound too scared. My initial thought was that we'd been joined by some police who'd received reports of us exploring the murder scene. The empty alcohol containers on the first floor told me that this place was probably the haunt of drug users and criminals. All it would take was a simple explanation, maybe with us walking away with cautions. As I entered the kitchen, there were no signs of police, just a friend staring wide-eyed at one of the white-painted walls. When I asked him what was wrong, he just pointed at the spot on the wall he was staring at, not saying a word. There on the wall was a small, jagged hole in the masonry, framed by some dark, muddy stain. It only took me a moment to realize just what I was looking at. It was a hole made by the shot that killed Kristen Lee. It must have been. The muddy stain around the ragged opening must have been her blood. I peered closer, recoiling in revulsion as I saw something that clung to the jagged edges of the roughly cut hole. A few fibrous strands of something dark and glossy, matted together with the same muddy stain that marred the white-painted walls. It was hair. Human hair. In all my time taking part in urbex trips, I had never felt so utterly terrified. I'd been chased by the cops, punched by angry security guards, but I'd never felt like anything like this. The death was thick in the air. It was a horrible feeling just knowing that something so terrible had happened right where we stood. I've never believed in ghosts or anything remotely paranormal, but there's absolutely no denying the feeling that came over us as we stared in horror at that hole that fatal gunshot had made. It was haunting. The place felt haunted. It felt exactly as if we were transgressing on some kind of hallowed ground, disturbing the restless spirits that lingered in the place they had so horribly lost their lives. It felt wrong. I turned to my friend, giving him a look that said far, far more than words ever could. He just nodded before we quietly made our way out of the building, not once looking back as he walked back through the woods towards town. I'm still very active in the urbex community, although I did take a prolonged break from it after what I saw in the Low House down in Surrey. I now actively warn people against visiting former murder scenes, telling them that some places are better left undisturbed. Like I said, I'm not a believer in the supernatural, but that doesn't mean that some places aren't haunted. Not haunted by ghosts, but by the reality of just how cruel and heartless human beings can be toward each other. Even by people they love. I'm an urban explorer from Scotland over in the UK, and I've been involved in the urbex community for coming up on 15 years. I've probably explored more than 500 abandoned places over the years, and at least 99% of them are exactly what you'd expect. Rundown houses, factories, and hospitals. Creepy enough to make for amazing photography, but nothing remotely sinister about them. Honestly, the number one feeling you get from urbex is kind of sadness, especially when the site in question is an old Gothic building that's more deserving of investment and not demolition. I've been to pretty much every stereotypically creepy place you can imagine. Old Victorian hospitals, haunted stately homes in the middle of nowhere, several morgues and operating theaters, abandoned graveyards, creepy basements and tunnels, you name it, and I've explored it. But one place was different from all the others. Out of all the places I've explored, only one genuinely scared me. A bit of background information. We absolutely adore finding new places, but it's not exactly easy. It takes a lot of research, and we get most of our locations from Google Maps, news articles, land registries, and the obvious shares from other members of the urbex set. So often, unless someone has left kind of an urbex review, we don't know what a place will be like before we turn up. Sometimes they're sealed, empty, or demolished, and sometimes I wish this place had been like any of those. We would have turned up, found the place inaccessible, and simply gone home or found a pub to drink our disappointment away. A lot of the time, my urbex pals and I will organize a kind of day trip, something to look forward to and bring relief from the stresses of our boring or stressful jobs. We'll go about visiting a certain town or city that has a few potential urbex sites, and then exploring them all throughout the course of a day. We get a hotel, find a few nice places to eat, but it also helps to socialize with the locals a wee bit. After a few pints, even the most hard-hearted of people will spill the beans on derelict buildings in the area. This one place was the last abandoned building on the trip. It was getting dark and rainy, as it often does in rural Scotland, but we decided to push on and get a few photos before sundown. We had kind of a long drive to get to the hotel, so we couldn't just put it off until the following day. At first, it didn't seem abandoned. Just a church in the middle of a very well-kept cemetery. My friend assured me that from his research it definitely wasn't in use, and I was pretty keen to get inside because abandoned churches can make beautiful photos. Only by this point, we were losing daylight at a rapid rate. We'd have to get in there if we wanted to make use of the last of the natural light. iPhone camera flashes just don't make for good photos. Only natural light produces the kind of results that get noticed on photography forums. The rotten back door to the church was wide open, old paint peeling in patches from the splintering wood. It was hardly the most inviting entrance, but the only visible way of getting into the building. One by one, making sure there was no one around to report us for trespassing, we made our way inside. Now, side note, a lot of urbex enthusiasts talk a good game about climbing into places, through open or broken windows, onto roofs to find service hatches and all that. I can categorically say that climbing an abandoned site is definitely not a good idea. From experience, the fastest way to the emergency room is trying to climb something that is literally falling apart. Inside, we came to what appeared to be a small kitchen. I'm not remotely religious, so it did kind of surprise me that whoever the priest was actually used to live in the church too. That kind of dedication to something so intangible is just beyond me, but I suppose that's why they call it faith. The kitchen naturally led onto a small corridor before opening up into the main church hall. That was the last time we spoke for a long time. There were beautiful color-stained glass windows, albeit a little grimy from the abandonment, but that's not what drew our eyes. A distinctly uneasy feeling overtook us as we saw just what was laid out in the hall before us. I, for one, was completely lost of words, while one of my friends went deathly pale, as if he'd seen an actual ghost in that old church. Instead of the standard empty pews and religious iconography, The interior of the church was filled with children's toys. They were stuffed neatly and uniformly into every pew, all facing the same way, forever listening to some silent sermon. All of the children's toys and dolls were worn and filthy, in a creepy kind of style that kids' toys haven't been made since like the 70s or 80s. There were little ornate prams, that's strollers for Yanks, and matchback cars all facing the same way, towards the empty priest's podium. It dawned on me that since there were no toys there, whoever had arranged them this way had stood at the podium and admired their handiwork. There was also a kind of bedroom area, one bed having been clearly made up for a child and surrounded by children's books. No adult-sized beds, not a single one, so I don't think it was anything like a homeless family squatting there. How long they had been there was anyone's guess, but one thing was clear. Whatever the reason these toys were arranged like this, it was not a good or pure one. We left the place, still in silence, too creeped out to discuss the scene as we drove back to the hotel we were staying at. The mood of the whole day had changed in mere moments. It was still too raw to try to make sense of the things we had just seen. Despite our outward appearances, the place was collapsing inside. A huge hole in the floor had formed and damp was setting in, so any evidence of the toys, the bed, and the sinister atmosphere may well be lost or buried soon. I don't know if anyone else had discovered this place or knows what happened, but it's not somewhere I'll ever return to. I refuse to share the location even with my closest explorer friends for fear if that they visit, they'll run into whoever had arranged those toys into such a ghostly congregation. I've seen a few scary urbex posts on this subreddit over the past couple of days. They've been some amazing stories, but they've reminded me of my own terrifying experience that I haven't actually thought about in some time. I've never really told anyone this story, but now I feel like this is the right time. I mean, I am pretty much anonymous here, and it really has been years since this whole thing went down. I live in Liverpool over in the UK, the place where the Beatles came from. It's a beautiful city with a rich cultural history, but beneath the old Victorian streets there are old mysteries that have never been solved. Dark secrets that pass from the world along with the dead men who kept them. Let me tell you the story of when a friend and I explored the Williamson Tunnels. The Williamson Tunnels are a bunch of massive subterranean excavations in the Edge Hill area of Liverpool, which were created under the direction of a tobacco merchant, landowner, and philanthropist Joseph Williamson between the early 19th century. Although generally described as tunnels, the majority of the complex is comprised of brick or stone vaulting. Essentially, a series of interlocking rooms have been carved out from the rock underneath the city. The purpose of the works remains unclear, although quarrying, a philanthropic desire to provide employment, and Williamson's own eccentric interests have all been suggested. Now, this all seems pretty harmless, just some rich old guy providing jobs for the local people. But when a local journalist by the name of Stonehouse became suspicious of Williamson's motives, he went about researching the true purpose of the tunnel network. On hearing that Stonehouse planned to publish his research on Williamson's excavations, Williamson's friends, the artist Cornelius Henderson, threatened to sue Stonehouse both for libel and trespass, leading to his journalism being suppressed for many, many years. Eventually, the British Army got involved and a mandatory survey of the tunnel system was ordered. Yet despite the massive amount of work that went into the surveying, Army engineers simply did not have the manpower to cover all the grounds. Larger excavations, such as the vaulted Great Tunnel, have yet to be located. Still think the whole thing is harmless? No, neither did we. So it came to pass that myself and a friend of mine, we'll call him Chris, began to plan a clandestine exploration of the Williamson tunnels, namely the parts that hadn't already been explored. We stocked up on a few snacks, 2 flashlights, each along with a lot of batteries. There was no way either of us was getting caught short in some dark underground tunnels. That would be like the start of a bad horror movie or something. Some warm clothes, 1 first aid kit between us, and we were set. I gotta say, it was incredibly exciting, planning a little expedition like that, knowing we'd be venturing into places that no one had stepped foot in for almost 200 years. We joked about finding a huge stash of treasure, Spanish gold and silver doubloons, but I think I half believed we might. Why else would a man dig so deep into the earth unless he had something really worth hiding? The whole real way to get inside the tunnels is to use the official visitor's entrance. The plan was to get inside, look like a pair of well-meaning tourists, then hide out somewhere until closing time when we would have the place to ourselves. Simple, but effective nonetheless. Naturally, it worked. We found some dark corner as far deep as we could manage without cutting away at the chain-link security fencing that kept us from the deeper recesses. After 5 p.m., a solitary security guard made one final sweep of the public areas with his flashlight, turned off the main power, and then went home for the evening. Maybe it was a bit early to be high-fiving each other, but we were still pretty ecstatic that the first phase of our plan had gone off without a hitch. The next phase involved finding a way around the previous mentioned chain-link fences that had been erected to keep tour groups from venturing into restricted, supposedly dangerous areas. With a little help from a pair of pliers my friend had borrowed from his dad's toolbox, we were in. We got out our flashlights and began to wander deeper and deeper into the unknown. It didn't take long until we were hopelessly lost inside an unending series of pitch-black rooms. I had assumed that there would be some sort of order to the layout, but each adjacent room seemed to take us deeper into what had to be a huge labyrinth underneath the streets of Liverpool. The deeper we got, the more debris covered the floors, chunks of hewn limestone that we began to stumble over as we pushed on. I noticed that my ears were popping just in time to hear my friend let out a yelp as he slipped among the rubble and crashed into the rocks beneath him. It looked bad. I rushed over to him, struggling to find stable footholds among the rocks, and was incredibly relieved to discover that all he had were a few cuts and grazes. I don't quite know why I did this at the time. Maybe it was because I knew from the look on his face that he had had enough. But I left him for a few moments to go see if there was any of that treasure stashed away in the rooms ahead of us. Of course, he wasn't there when I got back. Of course, the room he was sat in was empty, no sign of him anywhere. I was kicking myself. He'd obviously gotten annoyed that I'd left him alone and was now marching back on his own, bleeding and tired. I tried to find him, heading back as fast as I could to catch up with him, yet there was no sign of my friend at all. No torchlight in the darkness, no one responding when I called out his name. And it was about at this point that I started getting pretty freaked out. Either he was playing a bad joke on me, or there was something terribly wrong. Then, from the rooms behind me, I heard footsteps. Not walking pace, not at all. These feet were sprinting, hurtling through the rooms towards me in the darkness. I wheeled around and shined my flashlight, relieved beyond belief to see my missing friend. But his face, I've seen a look of terror so etched into someone's features. He didn't have his torch or his backpack, and he almost crashed into me as he sprinted through the tunnels. He just whimpered one single word as he ran. Run. To this day, he's never talked about what he saw down there that made him run like that. He started drinking a lot, even getting up late and getting drunk all night. It wasn't long before we drifted apart and he ended up moving down to Portsmouth, way down in the south of England. He was never quite the same after it, but that doesn't mean I haven't stopped wondering, and one day, maybe over a few drinks, I'll ask him. But it's not asking him that I'm afraid of. It's what he might tell me that really scares me. When I was in university, I used to work the closing shift at a McDonald's here in the UK, which is without a doubt the weirdest shift to work. It happens to be the most consistently busy shift of the day, yet somehow it's invariably worked by incompetent teenagers who are somehow corralled by a manager who are barely out of their teens themselves. And before you go saying that's a mean thing to say, or that I should have more respect for hardworking young people, I think I've earned the right to say it, because I used to be one of those previously mentioned incompetent teenagers. At about 11:30 each night when the closing shift ends, myself and a few of the guys who worked there used to go have a smoke at a nearby play park before going our separate ways. Only one night in particular, one of the guys has the idea to drive over to the grounds of an abandoned psychiatric hospital and have our smokes there. Granted, it didn't seem like the best idea at the time, but the guy was offering to drive us there and back and even said that he'd had a few beers in the cooler tucked away in his car. And trust me, if you finish a late shift at McDonald's, stinking of grease and sick to the back teeth of rude customers, you jump at the offer of a free beer. My only question was where this place was exactly. He said it was only a few miles away, at a place called Whittingham. So, the grounds that Whittingham Hospital is built on are absolutely ginormous. There are about 4 or 5 different annexes constructed around a cricket pitch, a duck pond, and even a small train station built specifically for the purpose of receiving patients. I'm not actually from the area. I moved to attend the university in nearby Preston, so unlike the locals, I had no idea of the story behind Whittingham Hospital. One of the lads starts to tell it as we parked the car and began to walk over to the grounds. I think if he had told me before we'd left, I'd have been much less keen to accept the free beer. Basically, back in the 60s, the hospital was the subject of a huge controversy involving abusive staff and illegal medical testing. But whatever the truth was, it had been lost in the subsequent rumor mill as the local population embellished and exaggerated the story until it was something of an urban legend. People talked of haunted buildings, mass graves, and patients who refused to leave when the place was shut down in the 90s. With those thoughts rattling through our brains, we climbed the large stone wall that surrounded the complex and began to explore. Each time we would wander into one of the dusty old buildings, we would often find that the floors would give way or that they'd rotted away entirely. It was pretty dangerous, but the sense of adventure was palpable. I had never done anything quite like it in my life. The sight of such magnificent buildings being left to crumble was sad, but exhilarating, knowing we had them to ourselves. There were long wards lined with damp, moldy beds housed inside huge Victorian buildings complete with towers. There was even an old church, which was just as creepy as you can imagine. I mean, it was like the perfect place to shoot a horror movie or something, and we relished the opportunity to scare the ever-living dookie out of each other. I remember this one place, an old operating room that we were exploring. One of my mates ventured into the middle of the room when we heard the rotten old floorboards creaking ominously beneath his feet, then watched in absolute horror as the ground beneath him gave way and he plummeted into the darkness below. It was honestly horrible to watch, but I can't even tell you how relieved we were to discover he'd gotten away with nothing but a few scrapes. The worst part was trying to get him out. It was absolutely filthy down there, and he reeked of rot when we finally pulled him out of that hole. But that wasn't the worst part, not for a long shot. We were exploring one of the larger buildings when we came to a locked door. By this point, the other guys had done a fair bit of climbing and crawling to allow us entry into each of the buildings, and it was my turn to pitch in. So, after crawling through a small, jagged hole in the wall, I got to the door opening and we all went inside. It was a huge mansion-style building with those stairs that are split at the bottom and curve round to join together at the top. We used our phone torches to cut through the pitch blackness as we ascended, following a long, dark corridor until it became clear what this building was used for. There were scores of smaller private wards with bars attached to the windows. It was obviously some kind of secure unit where the most violent of the patients were held. We walked into one, and it was like a loop back round to the main corridor again, evidently designed to make it difficult for the patients to hide or escape. So we wandered down, noting that all the beds were just metal frames with nothing else. But as we turned the corner, there was one larger bed, the only one which had a mattress on it. What's more, this mattress had a large, dark stain marring the once white sheets. It was a big stain, a horrendous smell emanating from it. Out of nowhere, one of my mates freaked out. He was pointing at the filthy, dust-covered floor, pointing towards a few patches of a similarly looking muddy stain that led from the ward. I would say that the most scared I've ever been was then. We were already a bit panicky, but seeing that had us fleeing the building as fast as we could. We decided to enter one more building before leaving, only it just so happened that this building was locked. Lucky, we found a basement door around the back, but you know those creepy thin stone steps that lead underground with a wooden door at the bottom? Yeah, it was one of those, hardly the most inviting threshold we'd ever seen. We pushed our way in and found ourselves in some kind of underground corridor that had all of the pipes on the ceiling running the length of it. At 6'1", I'm a big lad, and I had to crouch a little bit just to get through, so you can imagine how it felt. Tight, low ceiling and pitch black. We dared each other to go first, but surprise, surprise, no one would volunteer themselves. Anyway, this corridor seemed to go on for ages, and we concluded that we were definitely in the underground network of utility tunnels that connected all of the buildings. There were a couple of staircases leading off every now and then, but most were blocked off, so we just continued as we could. After a good few minutes of walking, we arrived at the end of one particular corridor. It had a huge steel door like one of those classic hospital jail doors you see in films with the little window hatch at eye level. With apprehension, we pushed this open. The room was empty except for one thing. There was a single metal chair in the middle of the room fastened down to the floor, and above it, hanging down from the ceiling, were two metal chains with manacles attached to them. Even if we didn't know the room's true purpose, it may be the most disturbing thing I've ever laid eyes on. None of us knew what it was and what had likely happened there, but we could guess, and there's no way it was good. I realized that as we were leaving, this was kind of a bizarre rite of passage I'd just undergone. This place was famous as a place of evil among the locals, but I'd never even heard of it. Now, after a night of exploring the most haunted place in Lancashire, I appreciated that now. I too had my own little Whittingham story. I would be able to regale both locals and my friends back home with the story of how I'd ventured Whittingham, but that came with a price. The price of never, ever being able to get the image of that final room out of my mind, and the inability to stop wondering about the horrors that went on in there. There's an abandoned factory complex in Detroit that I've often seen posted about, both on Reddit as well as various other urbex sites around the internet. I personally explored the place about 8 or 9 times over the course of a decade, and each time I've found something new. This is because the complex is absolutely massive. I mean, it must be a few square kilometers all in all. What I've never seen posted nor even mentioned, however, is the maze of tunnels that run underneath. The subterranean network or underground passageways is filled with pipes and wiring that provides everything from steam and fresh water to chemical compounds and electrical power. The tunnels are all extremely low and narrow that descend at least 15 to 20 feet under the earth. Each one leads into a series of basement rooms under each section of the complex, and to the relief of many urban explorers, are complete with emergency escape hatches that take you way out into the woods surrounding the factory complex. I can't tell you the peace of mind that kind of feature brings an urbex enthusiast. Not many of us have died doing what we love, but the number is high enough for us not to want to become just another statistic. One weird thing about this particular site is that most of the entrances in the tunnel system are hidden in the walls. I pushed my way through an old plastic panel door once and found myself in a room that was the complex's mailroom, a place that I'd literally been 5 or 6 times before, but had never noticed that there was a hidden passage integrated into the network's plastic paneling. The complex has been abandoned since the late 80s, so entire sections of the tunnels are practically flooded from leaky and busted pipes. When you're down there, you're constantly hearing ambient noises, creaking pipes, the rumbling of the railroad above, echoes from your own movement. There is nothing remotely reflective down there, and aside from your own flashlight, there's absolutely zero sources of light. Plus, if you skimp on the aforementioned flashlight and get one with a weak beam, it can get kind of difficult to make out details in the darkness. Often you're left relying upon the slight tonal differences of what you can see to determine what something is before you're right up on it. First of all, I had a really dumb and dangerous habit of going to these places alone. It's hard to find people willing to commit to doing such scary stuff, but the bottom line is that if you don't have a buddy to urbex with, you shouldn't go at all. Pretty much every urbex veteran will tell you that, and many people actually end up traveling to far-off places just so someone has a buddy to explore somewhere with. But the last time I was in the tunnels, I was by myself, with a single AA battery-powered 75 to 100 lumen LED flashlight. To the uninitiated, that won't mean anything, but any hardened urbex enthusiast will tell you that that's way too weak a torch for underground tunnels. With zero ambient light, you really do need something powerful to cut through the darkness. And that was my first big mistake. So while I was down in the factory tunnels, all on my own, I decided to follow one particular passageway down to what was probably the water treatment facility for the complex. The tunnel sloped quite steeply downward, so the leaking water I mentioned previously has collected at the tunnel's lowest point. At the end of the tunnel, I entered this large room with 2 huge water storage tanks, each of them at least 15 foot tall. There is probably an inch of filthy, stagnant water on the floor, stinking and making a loud splashing sound as I walked in it. Not exactly a deafening sound, I know, but when everything around you is completely still and silent, even the faintest noise sounds incredibly loud. I'm standing still, looking around with my flashlight, and from the opposite side of the room, around 20 or 30 feet away, I hear that same splashing sound. Only it's not an echo. There's someone else in this underground room with me. I shine my flashlight across the huge dark room, but I don't see a thing. All I'm hearing is that horrible wet splashing sound of footsteps in the water. All of a sudden, I shine the light on this human shape that is completely covered in black clothing. I mean, it was so black that there was no difference in the shading or anything. It's just like a shadow against the peach-colored concrete wall. I stammer out a nervous greeting, and all of a sudden I can see this person's 2 eyes flash up. A distinct pale blue back my flashlight. I mean, I knew it was a person. I'm not a believer in ghosts or the supernatural, so it's not like I was scared out of my mind. But people can be weird. I know that firsthand. I don't know if the person was in some kind of bodysuit or what, but it's impossible to make out anything distinguishing about them other than the color of their eyes. I don't know what kind of weirdo sets out in a full black getup to rummage around the underground, but this guy's silence was beginning to seriously creep me out. What's more, I noticed that he didn't have a torch. He didn't have anything in his hands for that matter. So how was he able to find his way around in the dark? Sure, he could have turned it off when he'd heard me coming, but at the time it really made me feel uneasy. After all, it's fear of the unknown that's without a doubt man's biggest fear. Then out of nowhere he just rushes me, splashing through the shallow pool of water, sprinting in my direction. I just freak out, spinning on my heels and absolutely bolting back the way I had come. I'm flying up the inclined tunnel, slipping and sliding all over the place on the slippery, slimy concrete. I fell down a bunch of times, grazing my knees quite badly and almost straight up breaking my wrist at one point. But I didn't feel the pain. Pure adrenaline just kept me flying through those tunnels towards the emergency exit. It must have only taken a couple of minutes to get out of there, but it felt like an hour of sprinting through this tunnel network, praying I wouldn't get turned around, praying the man in black wouldn't find me. It was the closest thing I've experienced to a living nightmare. I've never been so terrified in all my life. I'm sure whoever I met down there in the dark was probably as terrified as I was. Maybe they thought I was going to attack them, hence why they turned off their own light source and rushed me. That was just my gut reaction, kind of a primal self-preservation. Now, looking back, I have no reason to believe they actually followed me, and they probably ran back the way they came, same as I did. But just so we're clear, I've never visited an urbex site alone since, even if it takes waiting a while to find a buddy, because no abandoned building is worth meeting that one weird stranger who isn't scared. Back when I was a sophomore in high school, my friends and I got heavily into urban exploring. We spent a lot of time in urbex forums online, uploading photos and sharing experiences, but it wasn't long before we found ourselves in a kind of friendly competition with a group from Ohio. The Michigan-Ohio rivalry is very real, and although we weren't exactly into college football, we still relished the chance to show up our counterparts in the next state over. It was a playful rivalry, however. I mean, who could ever take pride in the whole "my state is more messed up than your state" thing? So one summer, my urbex friends and I were on a long bike ride, scouting for potential urbex sites in an old rundown industrial area out near Kalamazoo. We take a break in this wooded area and one of my friends goes off into the bushes to pee. About a minute later, we hear them shout excitedly for us to come look at something. Once we make a few jokes about his junk being nothing to write home about, we follow and lay eyes on his sweet little discovery. It was this creepy old cave. I mean, it seriously looked like it could be the secret entrance to the Bat Cave or something, but a little preliminary exploration revealed that the place was an abandoned cement mine. Mines required a lot more specialist equipment. Any seasoned urbexer will tell you that it's crucial to bring respirators to anywhere where air quality might be compromised. Mines are filled with all kinds of stuff that you really don't want in your lungs. So about 2 weeks later, after a fair amount of planning and preparation, all four of us returned to the abandoned cement mine with the appropriate safety gear and a camera, ready to properly explore. We discovered there was basically one main shaft that sloped down into the earth, so we followed that main route. It was wide enough to drive a pickup truck through and was still in a pretty decent condition, so traversing the mine shaft was much easier than we'd first thought. There were many rooms, old machinery, and rusting equipment off of this main shaft, but we mostly avoided it in the beginning. We were just trying not to get lost or turned around in the darkness. As we shone our flashlights along the smooth rock walls, we saw that they were almost covered in spray paint graffiti. Mostly just the classic abandoned building stuff. Jimmy was here, swastikas, initials, and dates. But as we got deeper and deeper, the graffiti really thinned out. Whoever was hanging out here before us obviously didn't go too deep into the mine, probably for good reason. As we wandered deeper and deeper into the old abandoned mine shaft, all natural light had faded, and we were relying solely on our high-powered flashlights. The air was so stagnant and hazy with particles that even the light from expensive flashlights would only go about 20 feet or so before getting totally obscured by dust. Oh, and that dust has us thanking the big guy upstairs that we'd remembered to pack the respirators. And the glow sticks that we had brought were basically useless because they would disappear in the haze only a few steps after dropping them, and we had only bought a handful. Once we were about 30 feet below the earth, we started arguing among ourselves. Our little crew was nervous about going deeper with the air quality being so terrible and without a good way to prevent us from getting lost. We somehow managed to override our anxieties by assuring ourselves that the path was easy and straightforward, so we'd have a hard time getting lost. We were going to rely on level-headedness, sense of direction, and flashlight battery life to get out. Despite the agreement to push on, it was becoming very creepy for everyone. We walked in total silence for a long time, hearing nothing but our own footsteps and the steady drip of water coming from somewhere deep in the cave. I think we were all pretty scared at this point, but nobody was willing to admit it to each other. Call it bravado or whatever, but we just kept pushing on. Pushing further and further into the mind, we stumbled across something that had us stopped in our tracks. Dug into the side of the deep stone shaft we were slowly descending was diverging tunnel. Little more than a passageway cut into the rock, it was narrow. You'd have to crouch to go through it, and it was also a good few feet of ground, so it required a scramble to reach it. But that wasn't what made us stop. It was the graffiti. We hadn't seen any of it for a while, and like I said, we assumed the graffiti artists had never gone this deep. But someone else clearly had, and the messages they left were disturbing to say the least. The tunnel was lined with words written in a white chalky substance, words like rot, decay, plague, and carrion. They were just words scrawled by some degenerate, but it scared the life out of us. Who else would come this far just to write such a terrible message in a mysterious tunnel that broke from the main path? However, no matter how scared we were, there was no turning back now. We had to see where the tunnel led to. Despite our fear, we were overwhelmed by the intense curiosity. So, as foolish as it seems now, one by one we crawled through the tunnel to the other side. What we found was a strange flooded chamber. Around the pool of water was a series of these large carved stones, each covered with dozens of burned-out candles. There must have been hundreds of pieces of melted wax dripping down each of the stone pieces. The walls had a few twisted, malformed faces scrawled on them, and the tunnel entrance back to the main shaft was ringed with a spray-painted, blood-stained mouth. What was this place? Some bizarre cloister where black masses were performed or something? An elaborate hoax set up by a bunch of kids. We couldn't find much evidence to figure it all out, and we were all absolutely exhausted by this point, both from the exertion and the adrenaline crash. We all crawled out of that weird little chamber and back into the main mine shaft, where we promptly headed towards the exit. When we finally saw natural light coming from the main entrance, we were relieved beyond words. We never did figure out what that mysterious cavern was for, and I think I'm content to leave it at a mystery. No, we didn't hear any eldritch creatures howling in the depths of the tunnel, nor did we find any entranced devil worshippers, but just finding that room, buried deep in an old forgotten mine, was enough to creep all of us out for a long time. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r.let's.read.official, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merchandise on Spreadshirt. All links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and remember, the worst thing about prison was the Dementors.